live. What up? What up? What up? Party people in the house. I'm gonna see if I can get my camera to be a little bit less bright-y. I think I can. Happy Thursday to y'all. I had something interesting that I want to talk about today. Not that anyone really um, needs to live on my schedule of thinking, but I was reminded of a story, and I actually tried to look up where I first heard this story, whether a book or somebody speaking at a conference. I don't remember. Um, but the story, it's what's called the pot roast principle. And some of you that have been in the business space or the marketing space may have heard this story before. But the pot roast story goes like this. There was a woman in her early 30s, just gotten married, and had a 1-year-old child. Those details are not important, but it helps you to find affinity with the characters. So that's why we do it. She was going to make a pot roast, and she was going to do it with a turkey. So it was really a turkey roast. I don't know, interesting to know if you call it a different thing, but anyway, she remembered from her childhood that her mom always made the best roasts. And so she remembered the recipe and how it was made. And she remembered that they always cut off the ends. So like the head and the tail, they would take a chunk and they would cut it off. And then they would wrap roast and they would stick it in the oven and be off to the races. And it was amazing. And she always just remembered that it was delicious. And one day as she was making this roast, she's making those cuts on the top and the bottom. And she thought, I wonder why we do this. I wonder what the reasoning behind it is. And she thought to herself, oh, it's probably, it's probably just better for the flavor or something. And she kind of told herself that story. Well, later when she served it, one of her guests actually asked that question. How come you cut the top and the bottom off? And she said, oh, it's better for the flavor. It helps to soak juices in and she kind of just made up a bunch of things because she didn't really know. And then after the guest actually asked and she was forced to really consider, maybe I don't actually know. She went and talked to her mom and she said, Mom, why do we cut the top and the bottom off? And she said, that's always the way that we've done it. And I think it's because it keeps the flavors in. It makes it taste better. And she did the same thing that her daughter had done about 2 days earlier and just made up some answer and then thought, I don't know for sure. Maybe she go ask grandma. So the daughter goes and asks grandma. She says, why do we always cut the top and bottom off? Is it a flavor thing? Like, what does it do? Does it make the meat tenderer or what's the problem? What's the deal there? And the grandma says, and I'll cut the story a little bit short, but the grandma says, okay, so you actually need to go talk to my mother, who was still alive at the time, luckily, because I don't know. Grandmother was a little bit more frank. She said, I don't actually know. I just know that's the way grandma always did it. And so that's the way I always did it. And that's the way I taught your mom. And apparently that's how she taught you. And so she goes and talks to the great grandmother and walks into her room. She's sitting on a chair and she sits down and says, great grandmother, how come we always cut the top and bottom off the roast? And she said, the pans we had back then were too small. So I had to cut the top and bottom off to make it fit. I'll let you take a second to process that. Turns out for three generations, this family had been cutting the top and bottom off the roast for no reason. Because at the very beginning, when they first started making that roast, at the earliest stages of that family, there was a particular necessity that was no longer applicable. Now, most of the time that story is told in business settings just to talk about not trying to do everything the way that it's been done before. But I actually want to talk about it in a little bit more nuanced of a scenario, because I think it's very interesting. And I think this applies in much more, it applies much more on a micro level. What I mean by that is a general principle that basically says, make sure that if you're doing something for a reason, that the reason is what you think it is and not you haven't just been told something else. Like, just don't do things just because that's the way that it's been done before. But I think there's an interesting nuance to this, where when it comes to interpersonal the interpersonal dynamic, either an office space or of an organization where different people are having to do things a different way. There's a couple of other ways that this finds applicability, and I was sort of presented with this pretty upfront this last week, and I wanted to share because I think it's first of all, those of you that if you know that I was with you this weekend, this is not going to be I'm not talking trash at all. This is actually a compliment, but it's just pointing out an interesting note. So what happens a lot of times in business is you have, especially for businesses that have been around for a long time, but maybe are not doing a lot of revenue and never really have been. So they're businesses that are established, but not really that profitable, if we put it that way. Now it can happen in any business, but it happens to be more those businesses where you have to be a little bit tight with the budget and they've been around for a long time because, I mean, naturally we do things a certain way, and I've been here for 30 years and this is the way we do it, and et cetera. Interestingly enough, what can happen in those types of situations is individuals can be tasked with overseeing certain sections or areas or divisions of the business. And those people on an individual level can become attached to a specific way of doing a specific thing, and can put a lot of extra emphasis on that particular thing. And it's just a microcosm of that same issue, the pot principle, the pot still roast principle, because those people, when they came on to the business owner made a comment that they thought was more serious than it actually was. And so they've sort of stuck with, well, this is the way that we have to do it. And I don't know if you've had this experience too, but if you have ever hired a consultant, or if you are a consultant that's ever gone into a space, a lot of times in the time leading up to a consulting activity, you'll get a lot of qualification, like very broad qualification statements like, well, okay, I just want to prepare you. This is the way that it's always been done. Or I just want to let you know, we can't do it this way because we have to do it this way. And my experience has always been, when you get in front of somebody and you actually talk to them and you challenge not necessarily them as a person, but the specific logic behind doing it that very particular way, most people can't back it up. And the reason for that is they don't actually know why they're doing it that way. Or, and this is the really thing I want to talk about, or they have overemphasized the importance of doing it that way for a reason other than the fact that doing it that way is that important. So let me try and explain this, because I know I'm talking in generalities and I know what I'm talking about, but you may not be following. Sometimes, say you have a committee, okay, and the committee is tasked with, it's a sales committee, and you have 3 or 4 people on this committee, and one person is actually doing the selling, and maybe it's let's say it's super high ticket, so the sales process is very long, meaning it takes months and months to get a sale, and you want to vet your customers to make sure that the quality of the relationship between you and your customers can be maintained. So you don't just want anyone to buy your products. You have a very high standard for who can buy your products, and it's a very high ticket, so it takes a long time to sell it to them, okay? Now, let's imagine that you are a member of this committee and you have another member of this committee. And you are the one that's actually doing the selling, and you have noticed that there are certain questions that you can ask early on in the sales process that will indicate whether or not the person is going to be qualified or not to make a purchase. Qualified either from a financial perspective or from a demographic perspective, meaning they've been vetted and those types of things. And so you understand, okay, I have to ask these questions at some point anyway. And if everybody who answers these questions negatively, meaning they don't qualify, can't become a customer anyway, why do I even want to talk to them? So you will push for implementation of systems and processes that will allow you to ask that question as early as possible, and potentially keep anybody who you know would not even be part of, who would not qualify at the end, from entering your sales pipeline at all. Meaning it's an initial qualification question, which will discount anybody who doesn't fit. Okay. You're going to push for that. And you may realize more than anybody else that you actually do a better job qualifying those people if they do make it into the sales process, but you're trying to make things more efficient because you have other things that you need to do. Okay. So what you're doing is, to other people in the committee, you are defending this idea of vetting people early, simply because it makes your job a little bit easier, and because at the end of the day, those people aren't going to end up becoming customers of that type anyway. Well, the interesting thing is, you are going to end up defending that idea to other members of the community, not because it's that important to you, because we just established it's not really that important that it be done this particular way. It's just important that everybody consider that people that aren't qualified don't need to make it into that part of the sales process. And so you're going to defend that to other members of this committee. So those members of the committee and anyone else they talk to are going to view you as being staunchly supporting this idea, but only because you're supporting it more than they are, which in turn is going to get you to dig your heels in further because you don't think anybody else cares. Okay. I'm trying my best to not be too blatant in my retelling of the story that I just experienced. And so the interesting thing is, now we've got this whole dynamic that's been created between you and the other members of the committee and everybody else at the organization, which is you are defending something that you don't actually really care about, and they are fighting you on something that they don't really care about. So somebody, like, for example, a consultant could come in and take a look at the situation and say, well, no, that doesn't matter, because in actuality, the whole organization is served by more people being put into the sales pipeline to begin with. But that's just a thought and a concept that you hadn't considered. All you're thinking of, because you've been tasked with, I need to make the sales process happen, I need to vet these people, and I want to do it as efficiently as possible. You're not thinking, and you haven't been tasked with thinking globally. You're trying to solve your problem. But if you were presented with the idea that, yes, that's important that they be vetted, but more important is that we get people, we need eyeballs in the funnel, so to speak. We need more people to go through so that we have a higher exposure rate, which will expose us to the people that are going to end up going through that sales process and being qualified. So we don't really care as much if they're qualified when we start. We care more that they're qualified, that the people that are qualified get spoken to, which means we need to broaden our message at the front end in order to get more people. So it's very interesting. And that's kind of like a mic. Again, it's a very, very specific situation. But the interesting thing is, a lot of times in these interpersonal relationships, and especially in office relationships, a lot of times we can find ourselves wasting time in meetings and in discussions about things that nobody really cares about. And yet we find ourselves defending those concepts almost because we feel an absence of defense for it, if that makes sense. So we think the concept, for example, the way I like to think about it is, if you think that, let's say there's three line items on the discussion for this particular meeting. So you have a meeting and this is what's on the agenda. And item 1, you, on a scale of 1 to 10, you care about it at like a level 4, but everybody else in the meeting cares about it at like a level 2. You're going to defend the idea, or at least your interpretation of the idea. And to the people that don't care, it's going to seem like you care a lot. And to you, it's going to seem like nobody else cares at all, even though in actuality, objectively, you don't really care that much either. You just care a little bit more than they do. And so it creates this feeling that you that a certain way of doing things or a certain concept is very important to you. And so now we'll bring that full circle. The reason why that can cause problems is because, if we go back to the pot roast analogy, if you put emphasis on doing something a certain way, but the reason why you put that emphasis is not because it needs to be done that way, but rather for some other reason, like, oh, well, this person on the committee doesn't really care about it as much as I do, so I need to emphasize it to make up for the fact that they don't. That's not that important. And it's not that important to you, and you would agree if you were pressed that it's not that important. But you've now created, because you can't convey all of that context to everybody in the business and every consultant or everybody else that comes in, you have now created a situation where generations of employees and consultants and departments are going to follow a certain path of action simply because you cared about something more than somebody else did. and not because it's actually that important. So the quick story is, I came into a consultation with the company earlier this week, and there were a lot of things going into it that people were very staunch about. Oh, well, it has to go this way. Well, this thing has to work this way. This has to work this way. And I came in. I talked to all of the important players. So basically, all of the people that were going to be that make the decisions, and the things that they were staunch and adamant about, nobody else cared about. Which leads me to believe that they had a conversation early on in their tenure at that company, and something was conveyed to them that made it seem like this particular thing is more important than it actually is to anyone. And the problem that can cause down the road is sometimes somebody on staff can have innovative ideas that are going to propel, not just move the business forward, but propel the business forward. But if you are not capable of objectively looking at new ideas and objectively considering a change in the way things are done, because again, you're tied to this idea that isn't actually accurate, you are going to give up on a lot of situations, and you might end up spending more money to either because it's going to take you longer to get something implemented, or because, like in this case, you need to hire somebody and spend a fair amount of money, if I'm talking about my own services, but spend a good chunk of money to get somebody else to come in and tell you what your internal staff has been saying all along. If there's a point in this, it's that if you're a business owner, there's a good chance that your staff already knows the answers, and going and spending $25,000 on a consultant isn't going to get them. It's not going to change the answers. In fact, I can't tell you how often I've gone into companies and I won't get prepped at all. I don't like to talk to employees beforehand because I don't want to feel like I'm taking somebody's side and like coming in and like I was hired to champion the ideas of a particular department to the admin team or whatever. So I like to go in cold. But what happens is almost unilaterally, I don't even know if that's the right word to use there, but almost every single time, one of the employees will come up to me afterwards and say, I've been trying to get them to believe that for so long, and you just said it right. And I didn't really say it right. I just said it different, and I just happened to be an outsider. And so, so I think it's important that pot roast principle. I think a lot of times we think about it in a very, let me think about this for me. How am I doing things? Are any of the tasks that I do now, if I look back, am I only doing them because somebody told me that's how it's supposed to be done? You kind of have to broaden the viewpoint when you consider that idea, because it's not just, am I doing things because my parents told me to do those things? It's also, am I defending ideas in my job because I'm trying to defend the viewpoint of someone else that doesn't actually exist. Right? Like if you found out that, I don't know, if you were a huge, let's say Dan Marley fan. This is a good example actually, because he's old enough that a lot of you that watched basketball back in the 90s will remember who he is, but a lot of you millennials don't even have a clue. And I'm not a basketball guy. I happen to live in Phoenix, so I know who Dan Marley is. I was growing up during that time. So Dan Marley was a player on the Phoenix Suns back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And he was known for his ability to shoot three-pointers. That's not an important fact for the story, but I just want to solidify to everybody that I know who he is. But what if I was to tell you, say you're a Dan Marley fan, and you have been for a long time like I am, I've never met him, right? I've just seen him on TV. But what if I was to tell you that Dan Marley doesn't actually exist? He was just this thing that was made up, and there was nothing actually there at all. Like that person never existed. There was a big hoax, and like a bunch of people caught pictures of him from different angles. And don't worry about the details. It's not a conspiracy question. It's, if you thought something existed and then you found out that it doesn't, what does that change? Right? What assumptions that you've made about the world based on the existence of Dan Marley, with him now being gone, now are changed? What changes when you suddenly discover that something that you were passionate about not only is not what you thought it was, it doesn't exist at all? That's kind of the same idea here, because sometimes we can even passionately defend and champion certain ideas. But the only reason we're championing those ideas is because we have a conception that that idea is espoused by somebody else that we respect. So maybe when we got hired, the boss said, you know, it's important that we have trust in our organization. Okay. And you have taken that even further than they meant it. And now you have a whole policy around trust, but they don't actually believe in what they said to the extent that you are now championing that idea. So I think I've beaten this horse fully to death. But again, the idea is question why you do things and be open to doing things differently, because there's always a better way. There's always a more efficient way. And the more open you are to implementing new ideas and trying new things, the more likely you are to find that solution that is the solution for you, instead of constantly dancing around between the next best thing and the next best thing. So see you next time. Peace.